Oh, this is great. Okay, we started the webinar. I see people trickling in, 22, 37, 40, 42, et cetera, et cetera. Thanks to everyone who's here today. Thanks to the more than 160 people who registered for this very special session with Dimitri Lascaris. My name is Brendan Stone. I'm the co-chair of the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, and we are a member of the Canada-wide Peace and Justice Network. So we thank them very much for their support and all the networks that have been promoting this. I'm going to talk about our sponsors, co-endorsers a bit later. But before we start today, there are some items about accessibility. For those that are just streaming in particular, you might have your closed captioning pop up already. There is a captioning button. So you can view computer-generated subtitles of what's being said in the main channel here. So if you want to see your captioning options, you can click the CC Live transcript button or equivalent on your Zoom control panel. And that way you can activate or deactivate the closed captioning subtitles. So that's an accessibility feature for people, and you can turn it on or off. And there's also, we're very pleased to say, language interpretation today. We have translation services available. And you can see the information on the screen share graphic that's being displayed right now. There's information about how to access that. There's a button called language interpretation. And if you select it, you can choose the French interpretation. And this will translate the spoken English into French. And when you do that, you can choose to mute, to silence the original speaker, or just leave it as is in a highly professional manner where the original speaker can be heard faintly in the background. And of course, this event is being recorded, but not the audience. The audience members are not being recorded. So hopefully that's not an issue for you. And just for those who just entered now, this is a webinar. And so we're gonna, that has a lot of implications. Basically, we're going to have a detailed question and answer period that comes after Dimitri speaks. So our event today is going to focus on the main panelist, Dimitri Lascaris. And it will be possible to engage in chat later in this event after Dimitri's presentation. So the chat window, I think, is presently off, but it will be activated later during the question period. Following Dimitri's opening remarks, there's going to be a substantial question period. It will even be possible to pose some questions in French, and I'll talk about that a bit later. But you can start adding questions in the question and answer box at any time. They won't be seen by the general audience, but we can read them, and the questions will be amalgamated and sent to Dimitri during the question period. So you can start thinking of your questions or even writing down your questions when Dimitri is talking. And I'll take a look at the Q&A box to see that it's active. And I'll take a look at the chat window at a later time. So that's all going to be popping up. And yes, you can see the information about the translation in the image that's being screen shared behind me. So we'll be taking a look at those question and answer boxes and such a bit later. So a few words about today's event. We're going to be bringing you a very special and unlikely talk. Dimitri is doing something extraordinary. That is, he's going to a country we're supposed to hate, and it seems like it is a whole country we're supposed to hate now. And he's looking for alternatives to the destructive path we are on. We had earlier applauded Tamara Lawrence for taking a peace tour in Europe. It's people like that who conduct people-to-people contact. That's what needs to happen more than anything else. So when you have Washington and Ottawa stigmatizing people and whole countries, you need to get around that stigmatism. You need to go to those destinations. So I'm going to stop the screen share there. Okay. And I want to formally introduce our very special panelist today, Dimitri Lascaris. Dimitri is a lawyer and journalist who is based in Montreal, Canada, and Athens, Greece. He began his legal career over 30 years ago with the Wall Street law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, first working in New York City and then Paris, France. He returned to Canada in 2004 and founded Canada's largest team of securities fraud class action lawyers, recovering over $500 million for defrauded investors. In 2012, Dimitri was named one of the 25 most influential lawyers in Canada by Canadian Lawyer magazine. From 2012 to 2022, Dimitri was a board member and correspondent for the Real News Network, based near Washington, D.C. He has been a guest lecturer at the law schools of the University of Toronto, York University, and the University of Ottawa. And in 2020, Dimitri Lascaris ran to be the leader of the Green Party of Canada. Some of our own audience might be familiar with that. We had events that were part of that, and he finished second out of 8 candidates. And he has a more detailed biography on his personal website at dimitrilascaris.org. So I think I speak on behalf of everyone. We all want to welcome you and give you a virtual round of applause. So thank you very much, Dimitri. Let's go over to Dimitri.
Thank you very much, Brennan. And I cannot express my gratitude enough for the organizers of this event, and particularly Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, all the organizations that endorsed the event, promoted the event. We all have a passionate commitment to peace, and I think you all demonstrated that by taking the initiative to invite me here and ensure that this was as meaningful an event as we can make it. I should say I'm not in Canada at the moment. I'm in Cyprus, visiting my sister, who lives here with her 4 children, her husband, and I'll be heading to Beirut later this evening, spending a week there or so, and then on to Istanbul before going to Russia in early April. And I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the title of this event. And it derives from an article that I wrote 2 days after the launch of Russia's invasion in February of last year. The article that I wrote was entitled, and I posted on my website, "The Art of Peace Requires Us to See the World Through the Eyes of Our Enemies." And in that article, I offered a preliminary legal opinion in my capacity as a lawyer with experience in the field of international law that Russia's invasion likely violated the United Nations Charter. I also argued, however, that Western powers bore considerable responsibility for the war. Since then, and I must say I've probably spent far more time than is good for my health analyzing and researching both the causes of the war and the state of the battlefield and the direction that this existentially dangerous conflict is heading. But because of what I've learned since that time, my views have evolved somewhat. Now, although I continue to believe that on balance, the invasion does likely violate the United Nations Charter, I must say that based upon what I've learned since then, I have less confidence in that opinion than I did in February of last year. And moreover, I'm now convinced that not only did the US government and its Western allies recklessly or inadvertently provoke this war, I actually believe that it was very likely the goal and the intention of the US and British governments, and possibly other Western governments as well, to ignite a full-scale war between Ukraine and Russia. And in my opinion, they actively sought this war. I now consider the evidence of that to be simply overwhelming. In the past year, however, there's one thing that hasn't evolved, and that is that I continue to believe that the art of peace requires us to see the world through the eyes of our enemies. In fact, I think I believe that more than ever. And what do I mean by seeing the world through the eyes of our enemies? By that phrase, I do not mean that we must agree with those who are deemed to be or we consider to be our enemies. Rather, what I mean is that we must try to understand them and their perspective. And understanding, I think it's elementary, is not synonymous with agreement. Understanding, however, can create a basis for finding at least some common ground. And finding common ground is, in my view, a prerequisite to a negotiated peace. If we are seriously committed to finding common ground with our enemies and to achieving the peaceful resolution of conflict, then we must endeavor in good faith to understand our enemy's grievances, fears, needs, and objectives. And only by developing an understanding of these things will we have any real prospect of finding sufficient points of agreement to enable mutual compromise and to develop the basis for a peaceful resolution of conflict. Now, although I'm not and have never been a military man, as Brendan indicated, I have considerable experience with dispute resolution in my capacity as a lawyer. I've practiced law for over 30 years. And during that time, as was indicated, I specialized in class actions against sophisticated multinational corporations that had harmed or had allegedly harmed large groups of ordinary citizens. And my opponents invariably were Bay Street litigators of the highest caliber. My clients, on the other hand, were ordinary citizens who had been appointed or who sought appointment by courts to represent the victims of mass wrongs. Now, once a class action is commenced, the parties and their legal counsel become engaged in what might be regarded as the jurisprudential equivalent of war. With one side, the corporate defendants, generally possessing vastly greater litigation resources than the plaintiffs and their legal counsel. And now it's true, of course, that in the type of warfare, as I'm referring to it, that we class action lawyers prosecute for our clients, the belligerent parties are not sent to their deaths. They are not grievously wounded. They're not permanently disabled. Civilian infrastructure isn't destroyed. Nonetheless, litigation is the product of conflict, and it is the means by which conflict in our society is resolved non-violently. In class actions, the stakes are generally huge, often reaching into the hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars. The lives of class members and defendants can be affected significantly, sometimes even dramatically. In many class actions, reputations are destroyed or redeemed. Economic security is strengthened or undermined. And at every step of the way, emotions can and often do run high. And in these jurisprudential wars, of course, the battlefield, if you can call it that, is the courtroom. Predictions as to how courts will determine the dispute are fraught with uncertainty and risk because the issues are complex and their resolution requires the application of careful judgment, oftentimes somewhat subjective discretion, and usually with less than full information. Now, yesterday I was interviewed by a German media outlet, Activism Munich, about the Ukraine war. And after I argued in that interview that Ukraine should immediately enter into negotiations with the Russian Federation with a view to seeing whether a peaceful resolution of this war is possible, the interviewer put to me this question. He said, many argue that Ukraine has the right to defend itself. How do you respond to that argument? My answer to him, or the substance of it, was, of course, Ukraine has a right to defend itself, as do all sovereign states. But having a lawful right to pursue a certain course of action does not necessarily mean that pursuing that course of action is in one's interests. If the exercise of a right is likely to result in the destruction of one's country, then the humane and rational course of action is to pursue compromise with the enemy rather than to insist upon the full exercise of one's lawful right. Now, on many occasions, this is essentially the very advice that I've given to my clients in class actions. It is generally the right of my clients to have their day in court, to push the jurisprudential war, if you will, to its ultimate conclusion, to soldier on until the victor and the loser have been determined by judge in what is, in essence, a zero-sum competition. Generally, my clients are legally entitled to insist upon a trial of their claims by a court of law and to request a final judgment on the merits. However, pursuing a trial of their claims and seeking full compensation for the wrongs they believe they have suffered does not always make sense. Often the rational course of action is for my clients to avoid the immense costs and severe risks of multi-year litigation in exchange for a certainty of limited negotiated benefits. And so it is with war. Indeed, the costs, horrors, and dangers of war are so extreme that the logic of compromise is even more compelling in the military context, I would say, than in the litigation context. This is especially true when the combatants possess the capacity to destroy the world many times over, as NATO and Russia do. In such circumstances, the logic of compromise is overwhelming. In a war between nuclear armed powers, the refusal to compromise is potentially suicidal, not just for the combatants, but for all of humanity. And in that context, the refusal to even attempt a negotiated resolution is simply unforgivable. Now, I'm embarking on this journey to contribute in whatever way that I can to mutual understanding. My objective is to gain a better understanding of the perspective of those Russians who support the actions of the Russian government. And we should be clear-headed about this. All indications are that a large majority of Russian citizens do support their government. Perhaps, too, I might succeed in enabling some of the Russian citizens who I meet on this journey to gain a better understanding of Western perspectives on this war and the variety of those perspectives. And for the sake of peace, I aspire to see the world through their eyes, unapologetically, not necessarily agreeing with everything they say, everything that they themselves hold dear as truths, and to do whatever I can to enable Russians to see the world through the eyes of their enemies. Now, a journey of this nature, in my view, is made all the more imperative by the highly regrettable measures taken by Western governments to deprive citizens of the West of access to the perspectives of the Russian people and their government. One such measure, of course, as many of you will know, is the banning in the West of Russian state-affiliated media, such as Russia Today and Sputnik News. Now, do these organizations have a pro-Russian bias? Do they sometimes, even often, disseminate disinformation? I do not doubt that they do, but the same can undoubtedly be said of Western media organizations. Overwhelmingly, Western mainstream media possess a pro-Western, pro-NATO bias, and often disseminate disinformation about the causes of this war, the state of the battlefield, and about NATO's intentions and Russia's motivations. And I categorically reject the notion that limiting the citizenry to one side's biased perspective is the surest path to truth. On the contrary, I've always believed that truth is most likely to emerge from vigorous and open debate between those whose interests are most deeply affected by the dispute. And indeed, that principle is the very foundation of our system of litigation, which we Canadian lawyers refer to as the adversarial system. The principle is that open and transparent debate is the best path to truth, not necessarily a perfect path to truth, but the best of various alternatives is, I would say, in fact, the foundation of democracy. After all, if ordinary citizens cannot be trusted to make sensible, intelligent decisions with the benefit of full information, why would we give them the power to determine who will govern us? In the entirety of the Western political elite and the Western mainstream media, I do not know of a single person, not one, with whom I trust more to discern the truth about this war than I trust myself. And that's exactly how you should feel. You, each and every one of you, are the best arbiters of the truth about this war. And in order for you to make the best judgment about this war, you must have unfettered access to as many perspectives as possible about this war. When it comes to war, I implore you never to surrender your judgment to Western political elites or Western mainstream media. Have they not lied to you enough? Did they not lie to you about Vietnam? Did they not lie to you about Iraq? Did they not lie to us all about Libya, Afghanistan, and Syria? Did they not lie to us about Israel's apartheid regime being a democracy? Did they not lie to us about torture at Guantanamo Bay, at Abu Ghraib, and at the hellish CIA black sites around the world? How many times must governments of the West and the mainstream media lie to us about war before we finally refuse to take them at their word? Decades of shameless Western deceptions about war lead inexorably to conclusion. We must exercise our own judgment about war. And in order for us to make fully informed judgments about war, we must have access to as many sources of information as possible. We must never confine ourselves to those sources of information which are approved or allowed to us by our political elites or by the well-heeled executives who manage media and social media platforms. They simply cannot be trusted. And in fact, I would say they've forfeited the right to be trusted. Now, for many weeks, and some of you may know this, the website of Global Affairs Canada has included a dire warning about travel to Russia. In big letters, red bold letters, the Global Affairs Canada website declares, avoid all travel to Russia. And it goes on to advise that due to the impacts of armed conflict with Ukraine, including partial military mobilization, restrictions on financial and transactions, and increasingly limited flight options, avoid all travel to Russia. If you are in Russia, you should leave while commercial means are still available. If you remain in Russia, maintain a low profile. Canadians holding Russian citizenship may be subject to call up for mandatory military service. Now, maybe Canada's government is entirely justified in issuing this warning. And maybe I will soon regret that I didn't heed it and that I went to Russia despite that warning. But after having been lied to so many times by my government about war and about the official enemies in the West, I cannot help but have a suspicion, which may or may not be well-founded. And that suspicion that is that at least part of the government's motivation for issuing this warning is that it does not want Canadians to discover truths about Russia and its people that might undermine the mainstream Western narrative about Russia and about this war. And I think that's precisely why they've tried to deprive us of access to pro-Russian media. Now, finally, before I conclude my opening remarks, I want to clarify a few points about this journey. First, no person or organization has invited me to Russia. There is no welcoming committee. My decision to travel to Russia is entirely my own, and I took it on my own initiative. Second, this journey will be entirely self-funded. No one has offered to defray any part of my expenses, and if by chance I were to receive an offer of compensation, I will refuse it. Third, I have not been paid one penny of compensation by any person or organization to write or speak about Russia or the Ukraine war. On my website and on various independent media platforms, you can find numerous articles I've written about this war. On social media, and particularly my Twitter account, you can find hundreds, probably thousands of posts at this stage about this war and our relationships with Russia and China. I have not been offered, nor have I received a penny of compensation from any source for any of those articles or posts. Also, I've done numerous interviews about this war, including on Russia Today. I have not been offered, nor have I received a penny of compensation for any of those interviews. And finally, I want to say that I really have no illusions about the limitations of this journey. I've never been to Russia. I don't speak Russian. I'll be there for only 1 month. Given the vastness and complexity of this country, these constraints mean that there will certainly remain formidable gaps in my understanding about Russia, its people, and this war after my journey has ended. Also, the dialogue that I hope to facilitate with Russians might have little impact. It might have no impact whatsoever on either the Canadian or Russian public discourse about this war. But there is one thing of which I'm certain, and that is when this trip is over, I will have a better understanding of Russia and its people than I have today. In fact, I will have a better understanding of Russia and its people than I could ever have by confining myself to relying upon Western governments and Western mainstream media to inform me about this country and its citizens. And ultimately, if improving my understanding of this country and its people is the only good thing that comes from this journey, then I believe that this journey will have been eminently worthwhile. Thank you, and I look forward to engaging you in discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Dimitri, and I'm sure people would all be clapping loudly if we were in a room. So thank you very much. You know, the fact is the questions already piled up, and people are raising their hand and such in the participants window. So we're going to prioritize French questions at this time in case there are French questions, because we still have our interpreter present. Now, looking through the Q&A and what's being submitted to me at this time, I don't see French questions at this time. We will keep our eyes open. Now, I have received some questions already that have been sent right to me. So going to the question and answer box here, we have one from Jerry Bonello. it says, do nations have the right to take preemptive action to defend themselves? If so, could Russia's invasion be viewed as a preemptive self-defense, given the fact that Ukraine was being developed with training and arms as a de facto NATO state?
And I'm glad you asked that question. I'm sorry, the questioner his name's Jerry. Is that correct? So thank you, Jerry. I'm glad you asked that question, because that is the very question that's caused me to wonder about the legality or illegality of this invasion. I've come to understand, since I wrote that article in February of last year, that quite extensive preparations were being made by the Ukrainian military. And this is important, apparently, to launch a full-scale attack upon what have come to be referred to as the separatist parts of the country. In other words, the Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk. Now, under international law, it's important to understand that the United Nations Charter emerged from the devastation of the Second World War. And because of the horrors of the Second World War, the drafters of the Charter were determined to limit to the greatest possible degree circumstances in which the use of force by a state against another was permissible. And they did recognize, international law does recognize to this very day that you can act preemptively as a state to defend yourself. But in order for that to happen, or to be justified, the attack from another state has to be, or the territory of another state has to be imminent. And I'm not aware of any evidence that these forces that were accumulating on the line of contact, these Ukrainian military forces, were planning an attack on the internationally recognized territory of Russia. The attack that they were planning, apparently, was on parts of what is internationally recognized as Ukrainian territory, or certainly was at that time. And so a couple of things happened behind the scenes, or I should say not behind the scenes, it was all very public, but it happened in a very quick succession prior to the Russian invasion. And that is the People's Republic of Luhansk and the Donetsk People's Republic, the DPR, declared independence. And Russia the Russian government immediately recognized them as independent states. And they then issued a call for military assistance from Russia. And it's at that point that Russia invaded. Now, had they been independent states under international law, they would have been entitled to call upon Russia, and Russia would have been entitled to respond to that call by providing them with military assistance to resist attacks from the Ukrainian military. The issue is whether their declaration of independence and statehood and Russia's recognition of that declaration and their statehood was sufficient to give them the status of sovereign states under international law. And I think on balance, the probability is, I'm not someone who's spent a tremendous amount of time looking at that important question, but I think based on my understanding of international law, probably it was not sufficient. The simple fact that they declared independence and statehood and Russia recognized it, that one state out of the many states of this world recognized them as independent states, probably didn't confer upon them a separate legal identity from that of Ukraine itself. And so we go back to the situation where an attack on Russia must have been imminent to justify intervention, military intervention. And I don't think there's any real evidence that Ukraine was planning to attack the internationally recognized territory of Russia at that time.
Sorry, I had muted myself. I'm unmuted. Yes, actually, the questions are piling up, and some people have made requests for various types. Before I do that, yes, I should mention, Dimitri, us, the organizations that are involved, and I'm going to list sponsors later on. This is not funded. We all have to get out and push to make an event like this happen. So we do encourage you to donate to the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. If you go to the website, hcsw.ca, there's a donate button, a donate section, and you can donate, or you can email us at hcsw That's hcsw@cogeco, COGECO.ca, and e-transfers are possible. There's a kind of very spontaneous and impromptu effort to make things like this happen. And it's really electric what we've seen in the email list that started sending out this event last night and the week before. So there's a lot of excitement, and I've received about 5 requests to know how many people are in the meeting presently. So when I was asked the last time, there were 173 participants in today's meeting. So that's very good. It's presently standing at 172 participants. So that's great. That's above our expectations, in fact, because only 165 people had registered. So that's great. We're really pleased to see that. And anything we can do to help Dimitri. I know people are concerned about Dimitri's well-being. So we've amalgamated some questions about that for Dimitri. In fact, we have questions from several people that basically amount to the following. Have you calculated the risk to yourself and others who might accompany you, or Russians who might meet with you? Will you have an interpreter for this mission so that you can speak to the people in Russia? And how will you disseminate what you see to us in Canada?
Thank you for the question and for your concern. One of my family shares. No one's accompanying me, first of all. Secondly, I definitely want to have a translator. And I've been in contact with a number of people who are from the regions which I hope to visit, who would be qualified to translate for me. I think the level of risk involved depends on where I go. I think that there are parts of the country where there are quite elevated levels of risk, at least relative to what we experience in day-to-day life here in Canada. And there are other parts of the country where the risk is very low. At this stage, my intention is to start the trip in Moscow and then to take a high-speed train to St. Petersburg for 3 days. And I don't really think, because of what's happened thus far in this war, that entails any significant risk at all. And by the way, I've spoken at some length to Tamara Lorenz, who was mentioned at the outset, who has been extremely helpful. She just traveled to Russia. She gave me no indication that she ever felt at risk. In fact, she had nothing but words of praise for the way she was treated and for the society that she encountered. So I think as long as I am in those parts of the country, there'll be very little risk. Things might get a little dicier when I'm going to try to go to the Belgorod region, which is near the northern Ukraine the northern border of Ukraine and Russia. There have been a number of attacks by drones and artillery on Russian infrastructure, and there have been injuries, and I believe also some deaths amongst Russian civilians. But again, the level of destruction there has been quite limited, fortunately. And then I want to conclude my voyage in Crimea and spend, perhaps as much as half of my trip in that area. Again, I think there's some level of risk, but the Crimea has not seen a lot of warfare until now. Tragically for the people of Ukraine, the vast majority of the death and destruction is happening on their territory. And I do not plan to enter the internationally recognized, well, I guess you could say Crimea is part of that, but, Crimea, with the exception of Crimea, I don't intend to enter what might refer to as the internationally recognized boundaries of Ukraine itself. And frankly, the reason for that is I think it'd be very difficult for me to get in. I think I would have to go as a journalist, and as it was explained to me, that would require a very lengthy and burdensome approval procedure, which I just didn't have time to undertake.
Thanks, Dimitri. I'm pleased to say there's about 10 questions that can be amalgamated into about 2 questions that we'll get to shortly.
I'm sorry, I left one thing out, which is very important. I wanted to, the part of that question was, how do I intend to report on this? My intention is to do video reports along the way. I don't know to what extent I'm going to be able to issue those video reports while I'm in Russia, partly because I don't want to spend a lot of time doing editing And I've got a month there. I don't want to spend a lot of time doing editing and uploading while I'm there. I want to spend as much time as possible meeting people. So it might be that my video reports are not going to be published until after I leave the country at the end of April.
Good. Although there are some questions that are going to be stuck together, there's one very specific question here I guess we should put to Dimitri. And that is from Greg Gillis. And the question is, Dimitri, now that the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, which neither the United States nor the Russian Federation recognize, how do you think this will impact the possibility of negotiations going forward, particularly when no sitting US president from Bush 1 and 2 and Biden has never been so vilified for starting their own wars of empire?
I have a number of things to say about this indictment, but let me preface my answer by pointing out that I haven't actually read the indictment. Broadly speaking, based upon my review of media reports, the ICC is alleging that the Russian government, with the approval of the president himself, was removing children of Ukrainian citizenship from the territory of Ukraine to the territory of Russia, which they say is a violation of international law, and in many circumstances it would be. My understanding is the Russian government's justification for this is that these children were removed from a war zone for their own protection. So I don't have enough information at this stage to really offer any kind of an opinion on the merits of these allegations. The question that I think you're asking, which doesn't really address the merits of the allegations themselves, is an extremely important question. First of all, let's just sort of step back and acknowledge, as you have done in your question, that the ICC has had ample opportunity to prosecute people who have flagrantly committed war crimes repeatedly at the highest levels of Western governments and of governments that are allied with the West. Of course, there's the war in Iraq, which was a criminal war of aggression. We all know it was. Hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis died. The ICC has had some 20 years to act, and it's done nothing, absolutely nothing. The US government, as I indicated in my opening remarks, effectively admitted that it engaged in torture, which is a war crime. The ICC, I mean, it's a slam dunk, an absolute slam dunk prosecution if you're going to go after these people like Cheney, Rumsfeld, George Bush, Condoleezza Rice. Nothing. They've done absolutely nothing. Today, I tweeted about, because in the statement of the ICC president announcing the indictment yesterday, the ICC president pointed out that children under the international humanitarian law enjoy special protection. Well, in my tweet, I pointed out that starting in 2009, I should say, over a decade ago, the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem began documenting the torture of Palestinian children by Israeli security forces. There has been ample evidence in the public domain of the torture of Palestinian children by Israeli security forces. And Israel is the only country in the world, I understand, that prosecutes minors in military courts, which are virtually bereft of due process protections. And what has the ICC done? Nothing. All of a sudden, a year after this invasion, it's invoking the special protection under international humanitarian law for children to pursue the president of Russia. And which this brings me to the core of your question. I think this has shredded the credibility of the ICC because of the ICC's obvious discrimination, because of its obvious selectivity. A truly just legal system is enforced impartially. That's clearly not what the ICC is doing. And secondly, I have to question the wisdom of the ICC doing this now in the highly charged political environment in which we are in. How politically are the leaders of the Western governments going to sit down at the table and negotiate with a president who is under indictment by the ICC? I don't think that this indictment is going to change one iota Russia's behavior. I mean, the sanctions didn't. That massive escalation of this conflict through the delivery of tens of billions of dollars worth of weapons to Ukraine didn't. The provision of battlefield intelligence by Western surveillance military assets hasn't changed Russia's behavior. In fact, Russia's become more adamant all the way. I don't see this in any way, shape, or form deterring Russia, but it is going to create a much more difficult political environment for Western leaders to sit down at the table and negotiate a peace with the Russian government, which is precisely what they should be doing.
Thanks, Dimitri. I've been informed that there may be a couple of questions in French, so we're going to look into that shortly. There's presently 179 participants in the meeting. I was asked about that again. There's a number of questions that can be amalgamated into a single question, a single short question. We have, for example, a question by Evelyn T, which is, you had said, Dimitri, that Russia was made to, or basically forced to, start the war by the United States. I also suspected that. Is there any article that proves that, or why is it that you say that Russia was forced into this situation?
Well, it's hard to know where to begin. I think the first thing I would say to you is, there is a mountain of evidence which has been conveniently archived, I believe, by George Washington University, that at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the various Western powers, not just the US government, repeatedly assured the government of the Soviet Union that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward. That promise was cast aside almost immediately upon the collapse of the Soviet Union and the reunification of Germany. And that's why it was given, by the way. It was given to the Russians, to the Soviets, because the West wanted to secure their cooperation when it came to the reunification of Germany. They could have easily blocked that with their massive military forces, but they didn't. And so what happened when they cast it aside? Various luminaries in the West began to warn loudly that this was a disaster, in the making. George Kennan, one of the leading foreign policy figures from the United States in the 1990s, said that this would be catastrophic if we went down this path. William Perry, the defense secretary in the Clinton administration, was on the verge of resigning. He almost resigned because of his opposition to NATO expansion. William Burns, the current director of the CIA, when he was subsequently posted to the Soviet Union, I believe in a diplomatic capacity, before becoming the director of the CIA, he sent a cable to the State Department, which was subsequently leaked by WikiLeaks, in which he said that he had interviewed people across the political spectrum, from liberals in Russia to, as he put it, knuckle-dragging nationalists. And there was universal opposition to NATO expansion. Everybody viewed it as an existential threat. We get to the 2007 or 2008 Munich Security Conference, by which time NATO had repeatedly violated its assurance that there would be no NATO expansion eastward. And Vladimir Putin finally stands up and he says, enough is enough. And if you try to bring, any more Eastern countries, and particularly Ukraine and Georgia, into NATO, you're crossing a red line and there are going to be consequences. And he even told Bush, as I understand it, that if NATO tried to bring Ukraine into the military alliance, Russia was going to seize Crimea. They were told this years in advance, and they did it anyways. Why did they do it? What possible reason would they have to have had to have done it? I mean, Russia at that point in time wasn't threatening Ukraine. Absolutely not. And in fact, there had been, elections held in which I'm sure governments came to power in Ukraine that were not at all to the liking of Russia. And yet there was no military conflict. So first of all, there was NATO expansion. Then in 2014, yes, people, there was a coup. We're being told that there was no coup in 2014. By any rational measure, what happened in 2014 was a coup. There was a violent overthrow of a democratically elected president, Viktor Yanukovych, which was orchestrated by the United States government and by the EU. We even have evidence that that was the case that we almost never have in any other, coup context. And that is, there was a conversation recorded between Victoria Nuland, a senior State Department person who had jurisdiction or authority over Eastern Europe, and Jeffrey Pyatt, who at the time was the ambassador of the United States to Ukraine, in which Nuland is choosing the next prime minister of Ukraine, a guy named Yatsenyuk, even before Yanukovych was overthrown. And sure enough, he did become the prime minister of Ukraine. The head of Stratfor, which is a consulting firm, which is deeply embedded with the US military industrial complex, he described this as the most blatant coup in history. And what happened after this coup? Well, first of all, dozens of pro-Russian Ukrainians were burned alive in Odessa by far-right lunatics. The Ukrainian government adopted laws which effectively infringed upon the language rights of Russian speakers in Ukraine. And then this resulted because Yanukovych's support came predominantly from ethnically Russian and Russian-speaking Ukrainians. So when he was overthrown, they felt as though they had been disenfranchised, that their rights had been taken from them. And this was confirmed to them when they saw the violence in Odessa, when they saw these laws coming out, which were depriving them of the language rights which they had previously enjoyed. And so they rebelled. And then what happened? The Ukrainian military began killing civilians in the Donbass. I think 14,000 Ukrainians died prior to this war. This war actually began and not in 2022, it began in 2014. And so Russia obviously felt an obligation. Its government felt an obligation to protect these people. Its government felt cheated. And we could have easily foreseen that that's exactly what was going to happen. And then, what happens with the Minsk Accords? Negotiations are entered into for the purpose of resolving the violence in southeastern Ukraine between those who didn't want to be under the rule of this coup government in Kiev and the government itself, or representatives of the government. So they entered to the Minsk Accords, and what happens? The Ukrainian government basically flouts its obligations under the Minsk Accords. The Minsk Accords did not provide for the separation of these portions of Ukraine. It provided for autonomy, limited forms of autonomy and this is something we're all familiar with. I mean, look in our own country, Quebec has certain special rights under our own constitution because of linguistic cultural differences, which many of us, certainly I support. There's absolutely no reason why you couldn't accomplish something like that in Ukraine. And that is exactly what the Ukrainian government agreed to do. And it violated the agreement repeatedly. And in fact, there's a US academic by the name of Nikolai Petro who's written a book about this, and he's documented precisely how the Ukrainian government in the days leading up, or the months leading up to the invasion, adopted laws which effectively made it impossible for the Minsk Accords to be respected by the Ukrainian government. And so when you look at all of this, either the leaders of the West were colossally stupid, and I don't believe they're that stupid, or they foresaw that Russia at some point was going to be provoked into invading Ukraine. And the thing that kind of cinched it for me when it all clicked and I thought, I think they actually wanted this, was when Joe Biden, several weeks before the invasion, stood at a podium with the hapless Chancellor of Germany, Olaf Scholz, and said, when he was asked what would happen to the Nord Stream pipeline if Russia invaded, he said, "We will bring it to an end. We'll bring it to an end." And this, of course, was preceded by a cascade of pressure and condemnations of Nord Stream by various figures from the US foreign policy establishment, Congress, and Senate. They hated the Nord Stream pipeline. The US government hated the fact that Germany and other European states were becoming economically integrated with Russia, and that their economy was becoming critically dependent upon access to large quantities of affordable Russian gas. They absolutely hated it. And the invasion provided them with the perfect pretext to do exactly what Joe Biden said he was going to do, which was to bring it to an end if Russia invaded. So, I can't read people's minds. I don't know. I can't say for certain what was in his mind, or, in the mind of Boris Johnson or in the mind of Olaf Scholz. But all we can do is look at how people behave and listen to what they say and draw inferences about their motivations. And I think when you look at I haven't, by any means given an exhaustive list of factors or evidence, but I think when you look at the totality of it, I think the most plausible inference is that the US government and the British governments wanted this war because it provided them with a pretext to bring to an end economic relations between Europe and Russia, and to fatally weaken Russia itself, and also to weaken Europe, frankly.
Thank you, Dimitri. Very thorough answers. I've been notified that there are a couple of French language questions in the chat. And while we still have interpretation available for people speaking French, I'll try to get these questions asked and answered now. The first question is from Michael Welch of Global Research, and he was asking how Canadians can support Dimitri's visit. And in conjunction with that, there's an English question from Judd saying, I admire you for your courage to undertake this trip right now. I'd like to ask, may I contact various CBC radio programs on your behalf about your trip and your intentions there? That is, if any are interested, would you be open to be interviewed on CBC? And the other question, French language, was asking about what are your feelings on the Chinese government's 12-point plan for peace between Russia and Ukraine.
I'm sorry, could you just repeat Michael Welch's question?
Yes. So Michael Welch's question was like the CBC question. Michael Welch was asking how Canadians can support your visit.
I'll answer both English and French. I mean, again, I look, I don't need the compensation. I don't need funding. I'm very fortunate to be in the position where I don't. And if it were offered to me, I wouldn't take it because I don't want there to be any suggestion that I'm doing this for any reason other than principle. I don't want there to be any argument that anyone could make that there is any kind of financial gain involved for me here. So the support that you can give is by disseminating whatever information I'm able to provide about what I learn when I'm in Russia. And, you know, when I start issuing video reports, for example, you know, if you can share those with people, share the information, whatever it is that you may acquire from watching those reports, that would be great. Obviously, the more we can share what those of us who are able to travel to Russia learn, I think the higher the prospects will be for mutual understanding and negotiated peace. The second question, the CBC journalists, look, I would love to do an interview on CBC. CBC has interviewed me a number of times, mostly in connection with my work as a class actions lawyer, also when I was running to be the leader of the Green Party. But of course, and I think a lot of people on this call aren't going to be surprised by this, I have not been contacted by a single journalist from the mainstream media about my views about this conflict or my trip to Russia. And in fact, you know, just recently, I've had several op-eds published by the Hill Times. Recently, and none of them having to do with Ukraine. Recently, I sent an op-ed to the Hill Times about the necessity of negotiations. And this time, they didn't have the courtesy of responding to me. Just completely ignored me, which has never happened before. So look, if I can get an interview on the mainstream media, I'd be happy to take it to, you know, reach as many Canadians as I can. And by all means, I encourage you to reach out to the media, but I would be shocked if anybody in the mainstream media at this point in time is going to be interested in hearing from somebody with my views. I'm sorry, no, there was a third question I may not have answered.
No, actually, you answered all of the ones in that sequence, yes. And there are a couple of related questions we had received, not from that, but questions that are related to each other. So the first one is from Sheila, and it's the question is, do you think that the US-NATO alliance has any intention of pursuing a peaceful negotiation at this time? And what, if anything, would bring them to the negotiating table? And the related question could be answered after by Morrigan Johnson is, with so many contradictions emerging over this war, should we give space for people to evolve? And what conditions might help Canadians push for renewal of a responsible anti-war governance and foreign policy? So how do we create those conditions? So however you like.
So I'd like to, you know, I'd like to believe that the United States is going to come to its senses. I mean, you know, let me distinguish between the U.S. government and the people of the United States. And you know, in amongst the people of the United States, there is growing opposition to this war, and there's growing opposition of the U.S. government funding of this war. And to, I think, the great shame of our country, the dialogue in the mainstream media in the United States is actually more permissive right now than the dialogue in Canada. You know, you have people on the left and the right on the mainstream media actually raising serious questions about this, but at the U.S. government level, there seems to be absolutely no appetite for war. And I don't think, there's any mystery about why. And I had the opportunity to talk about this yesterday when I was being interviewed by Activism Munich. It's the elephant in the room. And the elephant in the room is, what is going on geopolitically right now? Globally, what's going on? What's going on is that the United States government and its Western vassals, they're not allies, they're vassals, have realized that the gig is up and that the era of American hegemony is on the verge of ending. In fact, I would say it has ended. And they just don't want to come to terms with that reality. And by refusing to do so, they're imperiling the future of humanity. But in their own minds at this stage, as far as I can tell, the leaders of the US government, the British government, they believe that the era of Anglo-American hegemony is not over and that it's possible for them to perpetuate it indefinitely. And the way they plan to do that is by fatally weakening the two primary obstacles to US hegemony, and that's China and Russia. That's what this war is about. The Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian people are being cynically used in order to weaken the primary geopolitical opponents of the United States. And the Chinese government understands full well that if Russia loses this war, it's next. In fact, the lunatics in Washington may not even wait for the outcome of this war before they ignite a war in the South China Sea, before they drag Taiwan into a catastrophic conflict with mainland China, just the way that they've dragged Ukraine into a catastrophic conflict with Russia. So they don't want peace. They don't want negotiations in the White House for one simple reason, and that is because it doesn't serve their purposes. Their purposes are to weaken Russia to the greatest possible degree. If that ends in the destruction of Ukraine, they couldn't care less. Did they care about the destruction of Afghanistan? Did they care about the destruction of Iraq, of Libya, of Syria, Somalia, of Vietnam? They don't care. They've proven that in spades. They use people, and they're using the Ukrainians. And the only way that they are going to stop using the Ukrainians is if we stand up collectively, just as we did in the Vietnam War, and we say enough is enough, and we cause enough of a fuss, enough of a ruckus, enough protest, enough disruption of the economy to actually make them fearful. Only then will they stop.
Very good. You asked if there had been a third question previously that we might have missed, and I think you were right after all. I think the question from French language about the Chinese plan still has to be answered. So if you could tell us, what is your opinion of the Chinese 10-point peace plan regarding this conflict?
Before I answer, I just want to, as a matter of process, am I supposed to be answering the French questions in French, or are we going to leave that to the translator?
No, that'll be interpreted. We still have that for now.
Okay. So look, I read the Chinese plan. There's absolutely nothing in the Chinese plan which is inconsistent with international law. In fact, the very first point of the Chinese plan calls for respect for the sovereignty of states and territorial integrity, which is precisely what, at least ostensibly, the Western governments and their Ukrainian puppet regime, because that's what it is, are primarily concerned about: sovereignty and the territorial integrity of Ukraine. But there's something else in there which they hate, amongst other things. Again, entirely consistent with international law, but they hate it. And that is the Chinese condemnation of unilateral sanctions, which are a violation of international law. The Chinese government has in its peace plan that only sanctions that are approved by the UN Security Council should be imposed. That's precisely what international law says. And the US government and its Western allies have repeatedly flouted that prohibition on economic warfare. So that's one reason why the Americans have rejected it. But let's just be honest here. It doesn't really matter anything other than a complete capitulation of Russia. Any peace plan that envisions anything other than a complete capitulation of Russia would have been rejected by the West. And furthermore, the United States government is absolutely hostile to any idea that the Chinese will be given credit for resolving this existentially dangerous war. So it was an inevitability that they were going to reject this plan. as I say, anything short of a total capitulation, they would have rejected it. No one should be surprised by that.
Thanks. And on that question of law as well, there is a question from Brenda Thompson, and she asks, how does international law apply to the fact that the people of Donbass have been bombed since 2014, and the Western response was to ignore their situation?
Well, there's this interesting, I didn't mention this when I was talking about the legal analysis. There's this interesting, doctrine of some controversy called the responsibility to protect. And it is a doctrine which Western nations have invoked repeatedly with catastrophic consequences. They were purportedly protected. So, for example, as I recall, they quite vociferously invoked it in the case of Libya, which is now an absolute disaster zone. They, I believe, also invoked it in the case of Yugoslavia and Serbia and Kosovo. And then they proceeded on the basis of, their purported responsibility to protect to repeatedly, viciously bomb, civilian targets in Belgrade itself, something they're now, accusing the Russians of doing. So I think that this doctrine, while it may be superficially appealing, it is dangerous if it is done without UN Security Council approval. If there is an initiative at the international level with UN Security Council approval to intervene militarily or by other means, for example, with economic sanctions, in order to protect a vulnerable population like the people of the Donbass, wonderful. The problem is that the founders of the United Nations Charter, to their great discredit, conferred a veto power on a small handful of states, which they've used repeatedly to prevent consensus on these critically important issues. And so this, this is, I think, why Russia was very much, I have trouble, completely rejecting, I can't in good conscience completely reject the Russian government's perspective on this, because they did try to negotiate over a number of years to address their concerns. They did support the Minsk Accords. They did put together, just before the invasion, a comprehensive treaty on a new security architecture for Europe. And the Americans said, get lost. They did, again, at the 11th hour, ask the Americans finally to respect their commitment not to expand NATO up to the borders of Russia. And the Americans said, get lost. So what were they going to do? Where were they going to go? To the UN Security Council, where they would have been confronted by a British, French, and American veto? And I think that the problem here is that the UN Charter is fundamentally flawed. It's fundamentally flawed. So you have a situation here where, technically speaking, probably Russia's invasion was a violation of international law of the UN Charter, but it's very difficult to see what else the Russians could have done other than employ military force in order to address their legitimate grievances and concerns.
Thank you, Dimitri. And audience members should know, Dimitri, I think he can stick around until about 1:15, and at that time, he'll have to leave. We've been able to answer a lot of questions. I'm very pleased about that. I have two questions here. But before I do that, I was also asked, will this webinar be made available online? And the answer to that is yes. We are making recording of this webinar, and it will be published on the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War website at hcsw.ca. It will be a front page item, and it will go into our newsletter, which you should subscribe to. Go to the Contact Us section and tell us you want to get on the newsletter. We've got MailChimp, and we have a lot of informative updates of this nature. So we have two questions from Vince F. here. So I thought I'd just give them both at once. One of them is really only half a question. So question from Vince is, have you, Dimitri, found any conclusive evidence that Canada helped overthrow the Ukrainian government in 2014 via funding, training, and or arming anti-government protesters? I can't find anything specific. And he also asked you, are you planning to go to Crimea?
Yes, I'm definitely planning to go to Crimea. And as I think I indicated earlier, I may spend as much as half of my trip there. I've not, found conclusive evidence, Vince, of Canadian government involvement in the coup. I strongly suspect that the Canadian government was highly supportive, but I think the people who took the lead on that were the Europeans, and particularly Victoria Nuland of the State Department.
Okay. A question from P.O. Zander. How do you look upon the relationship between Ukraine's will to fight and our own Western support?
I think that the level of courage and tenacity that has been shown by the Ukrainian people in this fight is extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. I want to separate, that comment from the neo-Nazi elements in Ukrainian society and the military, whom I condemn in the strongest possible terms, absolutely condemn them. And I want to say one thing about that, okay, that, we often hear from those who are pro-NATO, pro-war, that, the problem of neo-Nazism in Ukraine today is no worse than it is in a number of other Western states. Well, I think that the evidence strongly undermines that suggestion. And I'm just going to cite to you one fact, and that is that the Ukrainian parliament in 2018 declared a national holiday for Stepan Bandera, a Nazi collaborator who co-founded an organization that was involved in the mass slaughter of Poles, Jews, and Russians in the Second World War, was allied with the SS. Bandera was a notorious anti-Semite, and any suggestion that he was anything other than a vile, despicable Nazi is absolutely false. And they declared a national holiday in Parliament in favor of this man. And in fact, it's on January 1st. And this year, in the middle of the war, when they celebrated the birth of Stepan Bandera and his legacy, Poland, which has been one of the most ardent supporters of Ukraine, issued statements. Its government issued statements, stridently condemning the Ukrainian government for celebrating the legacy of Stepan Bandera. That's how vile this character is. So I don't know of any Western country where in recent memory, they have, declared a national holiday at the parliamentary level, at the legislative level in favor of a Nazi. I mean, so this is a serious problem in Ukraine, but there are a lot of people in Ukraine. I'm in no position to say what proportion. There are obviously a lot of people in Ukraine, a great many, who are not Nazis. They're simply defending their territory, and they're doing so with extraordinary courage. But as I said earlier, that courage is being cynically exploited by the United States government in order to achieve its nefarious geopolitical goals. And this will end in the destruction of the Ukrainian people. That's the relationship between their courage and the goals of Western governments.
Very well answered, Dimitri. And there is a question that relates to that in terms of who is the enemy here, who is fighting, who are the combatants. Owen Hughes asked he said, seeing through the eyes of the enemy is a fine principle, but who in this war is the enemy? Putin has referred to Ukrainians as brothers, so presumably he does not see all Ukrainians as the enemy. Yet the current government has mainly insisted on continuing in spite of the massive losses already incurred. Ukraine cannot continue without NATO support. So who is, in fact, the enemy? Through whose eyes should we see?
Well, I think if you're talking from the Western perspective, I think the enemy is very clear. From the perspective of the Western political elite, the perspective of the Western media, and sadly, a very substantial proportion of the citizenry in Western countries, due in no small part to their propagandization, the enemy is the Russian government and those Russians who support the Russian government. That's the enemy. From the Russian perspective, I think the enemy is unquestionably the Ukrainian government, unquestionably NATO. They don't view the Ukrainian government as having any legitimacy because they are convinced that there was a coup in 2014, and that this government is a product of that that illegitimate overthrow of a democratically elected president. So they're the enemy. I think that obviously they would include neo-Nazi Ukrainians as the enemy. And, if you follow the discourse in Russian Telegram channels, which I do, I try to get as much information as I can about what they're saying. I think it's important to do that. They have this kind of, the dialogue around the people of Ukraine is kind of, it's muddled and it's kind of schizophrenic, because on the one hand, they seem at times to evince a profound sympathy for the many, many Ukrainians who have died on the battlefield. But on the other hand, they don't seem to have any qualms about killing anybody who takes up arms against Russia. Absolutely none. And doing so in as decisive and as brutal a manner as they possibly can. They claim to respect the laws of war, but I don't see any evidence that the Russian military right now is particularly concerned about the level of casualties amongst the Ukrainian military. I think that their objective is essentially to completely divest Ukraine of the ability to fight back, and that means the annihilation of Ukraine's army. But again, this is coming based upon my interpretation of things I'm reading. I think it'll be enlightening to actually try to flesh out that question with people in private conversation. And, hopefully, a number of them will be willing to go on the record and talk about this. I don't know.
Okay. There are some related questions. There's a short question, which we'll get to in a moment. It's from Tony. Tony said, I have talked to Russians opposed to the invasion. So are you going to be talking to Russians that oppose Putin when you go on the trip? Before we get to that, on the question of Canada's role, how did Canada participate in causing the problem that is now occurring? I've been informed in the chat that Eve Engler, the Canadian journalist who we hosted on Wednesday here in Hamilton, Eve Engler has written about this subject. So you may wish to go to his website at eveengler.ca and look for information about Canada's role in the conflict. Now, in terms of what Dimitri was just saying, there is also a question from Simri, who has it's more of a comment, a statement. He's saying,
I'm sorry. I didn't actually answer that question about, speaking to people.
Oh, you could answer them together, but if you want to go right ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay, that's fine. So yeah, that was question one. And question two, or statement kind of, is from Simri Gomery. And he says, Dimitri, from a strategic point of view, I think that you are pursuing a self-defeating argument by emphasizing who started this war. It distracts from the fact that the continuation of the war suits Western interests, like weakening Russia economically and make people rich. So if you keep going back to the who started it question, you imply that if we could establish who started it, we would know who is ultimately responsible for everything, all the bloodshed and destruction. I think we have to focus on the present situation and how to stop it. So if you want to address those questions and comments.
Well, I don't know how you solve a problem without knowing what caused the problem. How are we going to ever convince the Russians to lay down their arms if we don't address their, at least to some degree, their fundamental grievances? And their fundamental grievances emanate from history, and particularly the coup and Western support for far-right ultra-nationalist elements in Ukrainian society, and the repeated violation of the Western commitment not to expand NATO. I just don't see how you could ever satisfy the Russian government that it should lay down its arms and bring an end to this war by ignoring the history of this conflict. I think, in fact, that's precisely the mistake that we have made over and over and over again. We pretend that this whole disaster started in February of last year, as though everything that preceded it was irrelevant. Well, that's exactly why we're here where we are today. So, with all due respect, I think we have to pay careful attention to the history. But I agree with you that, the ultimate objective is to bring an end to the war and the destruction as quickly as possible. So I'm sorry, there was another, I forgot again.
Yeah, if you're going to be talking to Russians who are against Putin.
Yes. Of course. I mean, I will be happy to speak to anybody any Russian citizen who has, a thoughtful opinion to offer on this. But I do want to say, the only Russian voices we're allowed to hear in the West, and you do hear from them, are the Russians who oppose the government of Vladimir Putin and who oppose the war. I don't know how we can resolve this if we don't take into account the fact that, all indications are that the vast majority of Russians actually support Putin. I want to find out why they support him. I know why there are Russians who oppose the war. They have perfectly legitimate reasons for opposing the war, as we all do. But what we're not hearing from is why some 80% of the Russian people, according to reputable polling data, support the Russian government. And that's the level of support that the polling data has shown the Putin government to have ever since the invasion began.
Now, Dmitry, I know you wanted to leave around 1:15. Did you have time to address a couple of questions that were kind of together? Okay.
Sure.
People are very interested in your travels and kept asking questions. We amalgamated some of them. One person was asking about Lebanon as to, the question kind of disappeared there, but was there a reason that you're going to Lebanon? They're asking about that, either previously or presently. And a related question from Morgan. He said, Dmitry, I have many international friends, and it's helped me go beyond the politics of nations. So how important is friendship and personal connection with Russian people or people around the world?
It's absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. I think that the more personal interactions we have with Russians, not just Russians, I can't stress this enough, not just the minority of Russians who oppose the Putin government, but the majority who support the Putin government, the more likely we are on both sides to be willing to engage in mutual compromise. It's very, very hard to demonize people with whom you have a personal connection. It's quite relatively easy to demonize people with whom you have no personal connection whatsoever. In terms of Lebanon, look, I kind of resolved that I was going to focus this year on seeing parts of the world that are, suffering, that are going through very difficult times, that have been victimized, by the Western media and Western political elites. Lebanon is a country that's deeply troubled. I've never been there before. There's a large population of Syrian refugees in Lebanon. I'm planning on visiting. I want to interact with them. I'm planning on visiting on my first day tomorrow a Palestinian refugee camp, including the Sabra camp, which was the site of heinous war crimes by the Israeli government long ago. I hope to be able to travel to Damascus just for a day, which would be obviously very limited interaction, but at least give me some personal firsthand contact with the terrible situation that the Syrian people confront. There was, as many of you may know, there was a terrible explosion in Beirut last year, which just devastated a large part of the city. And the country has never really recovered from that. And the last thing I want to say is, there's a very interesting dynamic in Lebanese politics, very challenging dynamic with, Hezbollah and, other factions of Lebanese society. I want to try to come and understand that, what exactly is the view amongst ordinary Lebanese about Hezbollah? Do they see it as a force for good? Do they see it as a force for evil? Is it fair to characterize it the way it's characterized in the West? So I hope that, at least gain some limited understanding of all these things during my time there.
Okay, so how are we feeling, Dmitry? I know it's almost time for you to go. Did you want to address any more questions, or what's your status?
I think I have time for one more question.
Okay, let's see here. David Kattenberg has asked two questions, so we got to give him one here. The first, take whichever you have time to address. He said, do you think the Palestinian people should negotiate terms with the Israelis? Perhaps that's being asked in relation to this conflict. And David Kattenberg also, he was saying, he says, does the fact that Vladimir Putin is a gangster, something I believe, he put in brackets, complicate peacemaking?
I'm sorry, could you tell me this? Can I just focus on the first question, because I don't really have time to answer more than that, and which I think is a great question. By the way, David, Great to see you, brother. I'm glad you joined the call. Some of you may know David is a dear friend of mine, and I've had the privilege of representing him in long-standing litigation revolving around the sale of Israeli settlement mines in Canada. David is a hero of human rights in this country. So this question, which you've asked, is extremely important. And my position with respect to the Palestinian people is, I think there's some very interesting parallels between the dilemma they confront and the dilemma the Ukrainian people confront. The Palestinian people, there's no real hope of the Palestinian people ever defeating the Israeli military. That's just not going to happen. And so they have a right to resist, just like the Ukrainian people do. Armed resistance, as long as it's not targeting civilians but targeting the occupying army, is entirely within their rights. I've said for many years, long before the Ukraine invasion happened, that I would oppose and I would counsel Palestinians not to resort to violence, even against the occupying army, because it will only end in pain and suffering for them. This is not a fight that they can win. And even though it would be very unfair to the Palestinian people, just looking at it strictly from the perspective of history, to give them a state on the 1967 borders, which would effectively allocate to them substantially less than the majority of the territory in their own homeland, if I were advising them, I would urge them to take that deal. It's never been on the table, never, even though the international community has long supported a Palestinian state along the 1967 borders. But if it were suddenly magically to be on the table, I, as their advisor, would strongly urge them to take it. Why? Is it because it's a fair division of the land? No. But because it's the best deal that they can get, and it will give them peace and finally give them a homeland that is viable. Now, in the case of the Ukrainians, they're in a similar situation, in my opinion, in that they can't win this war. They're going up against a country that has a much bigger army, a much bigger economy, a much bigger population to replenish its military forces. No matter how many casualties the two sides sustain, Russia will always be able to out-mobilize the Ukrainians. Russia's industrial capacity to produce the kind of weaponry that's needed for this war, which is principally artillery, surpasses that of apparently all of NATO, based on the reports I'm seeing. The Russians have inexhaustible supplies of fossil fuels, without which you cannot, operate a large mechanized army for a sustained period of time. The Russians have nukes. Ukraine doesn't have any nukes. The Russians say they regard this as an existential threat. They tend not to bluff. So if they actually were losing, they might very well resort to nuclear weapons. This is not a war that Ukraine can win. The sensible thing for Ukraine to do is to negotiate land for peace. I would give them the same advice that I would give to Palestinians. And it wouldn't be the deal that the Palestinians would get if the international consensus were respected. They would retain the vast majority of the land, some 80%, if they were to allow the Russians to retain those parts of the country they now control, whereas the Palestinians would get less than 50% of the land in their own homeland. So I think that these are interesting parallels in my position. I personally believe my position in these two conflicts are perfectly consistent. Don't resort to armed conflict. That's not a fight you can win. Do a deal that will bring an end to the suffering and the pain, and allow your children and your grandchildren to live in peace and to create a flourishing country.
Thank you so much, Dimitri. This has all been very well spoken and inspiring, and people have been very impressed according to the Q&A box and the chat. So we're very appreciative, not just for the time you're giving us while you are out of the country right now, but the fact that you've given us such a skillful discussion, and that one that is so engaging. A lot of the remaining questions are just about how people can help. Like the CBC question: can they get you on CBC? Is anyone ever going to be talking to you in mainstream media, etc.? How can they tour you when you get back? And of course, how can people get this video, which I'll get to. So Dimitri, thank you very much. I hope we can get you in touch with the people that are asking these questions, and with the people asking strategic questions about the peace movement. There have been a couple of those we couldn't really get into, how to broaden this, how to get this out to everyone, that sort of thing. So maybe there'll be follow-up on that at some point. So thank you very much, Dimitri.
Thank you, everybody. I really can't thank all of the organizers enough. This was a tremendous idea. And for those who came and asked me these outstanding questions and engaged in the discussion, and your patience and your understanding, I deeply appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Dimitri. And I'm going to explain, how many attendees? We got that question once again.
I'm sorry, Brent, I do need to go.
Yep, you can pop out. You can,
okay. Thanks, everybody.
Yep, okay. There we go. And we'll just mute there. And so that's, wow, he actually gave us 10 extra minutes. That's great. So thanks, Dimitri. Really appreciate that. And with regard to the questions about how to find all this stuff online and get it on YouTube, we're getting a lot of those and questions of a similar nature in the chat right now, and strategic questions. I'll inform you about that in just a moment, but I want to briefly read out the sponsoring organizations, the co-endorsers of today's event, because it wasn't just put on by one organization, but other people circulated it in their network. So we want to thank Peace Quest Cape Breton, Peace Alliance Winnipeg, Manitoba Peace Council, Regina Peace Council, Global Peace Alliance British Columbia, Just Peace Advocates, Calgary Peace Council, Montreal for World Beyond War, Fire This Time Movement for Social Justice, International Manifesto Group, Geopolitical Economy Research Group, and we want to thank those last two in particular for offering us their Zoom services, Pax Christi Toronto, Mobilization Against War and Occupation, MAWO, and the Canadian BDS Coalition. And the main sponsoring organization, Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War. If you want to get in touch with us, you can go to our website at hcsw.ca. And that's the part about getting this video that I wanted to just mention once again, because of course, this whole event will be placed online. It will be placed on YouTube. And that YouTube video will be posted on the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War website. So please, in a few days, visit the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War website at hcsw.ca. And also go to that website, go to our Contact Us section, and you can, inform us that you'd like to be placed on the mailing list, which a mailing or mailer will be sent out to everyone containing the video and of the Wednesday event we did with Eve Engler as well. So please get on our email list, and you can donate as well via the donate section. So thanks very much, everyone. Thanks to our technical assistant, coordinator, as well as translation and question assistant and translation volunteer. So you all made it possible today. We're very grateful, and this has been a wonderful event, and it presages or suggests great things for the peace movement. So thanks everyone who came. Thanks to the 178 people, and nice to see these favorable comments in the chat. So we'll be ending it here, and we'll make the video online, and we're glad to see everyone that came today. So see you.